Welcome to the English Suite podcast, the voice of Widener English and Creative Writing, hosted by Jim Esch. I'm Christina Geska. In today's episode, we feature an interview with visiting writer Ruben Quesada. Ruben visited classes, conducted one-on-one tutorials, and held a public Zoom reading of his work in February. Ruben Quesada is the author of two chapbooks of poetry and translations, Revelations and Exiled from the Throne of Night, selected translations of Lewis Sunuda, and a collection of poetry next extinct mammal. His writing has appeared in Best American Poetry, Harvard Review, American Poetry Review, Tri-Quarterly, and other anthologies and journals. Quesada has taught courses on literary translation, poetry, poetics, and literary theory at the undergraduate and graduate level. He has taught for Vermont College of Fine Arts, UCLA Writers Program, Northwestern University, the School of the Art Institute, Columbia College Chicago, Texas Tech University, and University of California, Riverside. He is the founder of the Latinx Writers Caucus, an organization concerned with the education, equity, and inclusion of Latinx writers in the literary and publishing community. He is co-editing an anthology of essays on Latinx poetry and poetics with Natalie Center-Zapico, slated for publication by University of New Mexico Press. Currently, he serves as a translator and site coordinator for Illinois Humanities, a blogger at the Kenyon Review, and a poetry editor at Agni. In spring 2021, he will begin serving on the board of the National Book Critics Circle. To help us get acquainted with Ruben Quesada's writing, Jim Esch chatted with Dr. Jessica Guzman, who coordinated his visit.
Jessica, you helped bring Ruben Quesada on campus, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what you like about his work and his reputation. Kind of give us a verbal summary of what his poetry is like.
Sure. Well, first, thanks so much for having me. When I was considering different writers, and especially poets that we could bring to campus for this semester, one of the things that I really wanted to do was find someone who has a very distinct style and someone who had an extensive background in publishing, in editing, in the editing world, because the writing for publication class is happening this semester. So I really wanted those things to complement each other. Ruben's work Ruben has just an amazing reputation, I will say, in the poetry community, in the Latinx community. He's one of the co-founders of the Latinx Writers Caucus, and he is very community driven. I remember the very first time I became somewhat aware of Ruben as a poet and just a member of the literary community. I was actually at AWP. Maybe it was, I think it was LA, AWP in LA. So that might have been 2016. And I had heard his name before, but I wasn't very familiar with his work. And I wasn't very familiar with what he had done to that point, even though he'd already released a book and all of that. And so I remember I went to what at that time was the very first meeting of the Latinx Writers Caucus, which for me as a Latinx writer was something I was really excited about. And I was listening to him kind of moderate the panel and talk, and he had such expertise. And I remember afterwards looking up his poetry, wanting to just know more about him. And then in, I think, 2018, 2019, maybe 2019, he came out with Revelations on Sibling Rivalry Press. And what first struck me about his work is how, if you look at his first book, his first collection, Next Extinct Mammal, and you look at Revelations, there are moments where you almost wouldn't even think it's the same poet, I feel. His work in Next Extinct Mammal is is formally very driven by the line. And, when you look at a lot of his poems, if I usually think of poetry, and I describe it to students this way, as existing on something of a continuum. Like you have lyric poetry on one end and narrative poetry on the other. And traditionally, I think of someone like Ruben's work and his work in Next Extinct Mammal as being kind of in the middle, where it's certainly lyric poetry, but you can often find a kind of narrative in it. Like he has one poem that I taught this semester to all of my students that's titled something like Photograph of My Parents. And it's describing, the first stanza is describing the photograph. And, the poem works through very orderly in a kind of narrative sense of here's the photograph. This is what my parents are doing. This is what's happening in the background. And you can kind of imagine, the story of his parents unfolding or the speaker's parents unfolding as you read it. And then when you get to Revelations and a lot of prose poems, because a lot of Revelations is prose poetry, it suddenly moves, and I'm going to quote Stefan here, because Stefan said this during our discussion in class, it almost feels stream of conscious. It kind of, you have one image leading to the next, and it feels narrative, but when you look carefully, it's not really giving a narrative. Not a clear narrative. There are jumps in time, jumps in space. You think you're in one location and then suddenly you're in another. And as Ruben mentioned during the reading, the poems are numbered, but they don't necessarily feel like they're separate poems with separate titles. And he didn't give them separate titles. And so you're just kind of moving from one moment to the next. And in 1 minute, he's talking about pop culture and Rock Hudson and, Reagan's response to the AIDS epidemic. And in the next poem, it's suddenly about, being a boy and kind of seeing a person die and possibly attending their funeral. And then suddenly it's jumping to, being an adult and being with a lover in bed. It's just a lot of kind of movement. And so I really enjoyed how his work has changed a lot in meaningful ways as he's published his different books. And I thought that would be a great thing for students to be able to kind of see this distinct change in style from one book to the next. And so that's something about his style specifically that I was thinking about.
One question in this book of prose poetry, I'm curious with the numbered pieces, do you, as you're reading the whole book, do you feel like there's any kind of narrative flow, even though it's jumping around all over the place? Does it feel like there's an order to it or is it more almost like a collage effect?
I would say, I think you say collage effect, and to me that feels very accurate for Revelations. It feels much more like that kind of, a moment here, a moment there. He does have the occasional poem that is lineated, but in general, a lot of them are prose poems. And then that book actually also has, that chapbook has the occasional poem or excerpt of a poem by Luis Cernuda, who is not even, is a completely different poet that Ruben translates. He often translates Cernuda's work. And so it's to me, that makes it feel even more like a collage, I guess is what I'm thinking. It feels even more like a collage because it's not even just that there isn't a straight narrative, but then you have interspersing Ruben's speakers, this other speaker, this other voice that is Cernuda's voice, translated by Ruben. And in that sense, maybe I might describe it as filtered, right? At that point, I feel like it's filtered through Ruben's own voice as a poet, because you can't help, I think translators cannot help but leave some of themselves in their translations. So I do think there's something to it that then matches Ruben's work. And he clearly thought so because he included them alongside his own poems, but it definitely increases that sense of a collage and the collage effect to me.
Let's hear a sample of Ruben Quesada's work. Here's a poem called Nostalgia that he read at the public reading.
Nostalgia. Too much time has passed, and I've almost lost this freight of memories, that dawning of light over blue stem grass prairies, the large flowered beard tongue and skeleton weed, or failed to preserve the slow sea roar in my lungs, expanding against my breastbone, my nose numbing from the cold, my lashes freezing in clusters of snowflakes. Here, alone on the westbound train in Des Moines, rescued from the wind chill of the Raccoon River. Homes rise like icebergs along East Locust Street. The patina of my black hair moving past flurried storefronts might be mistaken for the next extinct mammal in America.
Correspondent Matt Lomas had a chance to interview Ruben about his writing life and the kinds of things that keep him up at night.
Recently in my classes, I've been reading a lot of essays on like why writers write and like what their experiences have been, like first jumping into the literary world, whether it be like books they read or things they write or things they see. What was your first encounter with being interested in writing or writing in general?
You know, my journey with writing is a bit peculiar. When I was about 13, I started keeping a journal, and it was just anything from letters to people or just things I was thinking about that particular day. But I kept a journal, kind of like a diary, I suppose. But you know, sometimes I would write poems in them, you know, in the journals. But it wasn't something that I thought I could do professionally or have a life with writing. It wasn't until I was a senior in high school, and by this point I'd been applying to colleges, and I knew that I could go and study writing and I could study literature. I could be an English major, and so I applied to schools as an English major, but that was my fallback. I was initially interested in physics, and so I was getting ready to go to college to be a physicist. I love science. I was good at it. I was good at math. And so my senior year, our English teacher offered this extra credit assignment. And it was to submit an essay or a poem to the Los Angeles Times. I grew up in Los Angeles. And it was a contest, an essay poetry contest to celebrate a California activist named Cesar Chavez. And so students in my class wrote the poems, wrote the essays, handed them in. Our teacher then mailed them off to the LA Times. But I wrote what I wanted to write, but I never turned it in. I just didn't. I just thought, oh, this is, I'm not going to do this. What's the point? And a good friend of mine said, let me see what you wrote. And so I shared it with her, and she ended up mailing it out to the contest. And I ended up winning. So my teacher gave me extra credit, even though I never turned it into her. And that really kind of changed my attitude about what I could do with my writing. And it was at that point I thought, you know what, I'm gonna go study writing somewhere. I'm gonna study English and study writing. It felt so fulfilling to be able to produce something that I held within me, and for it to just be acknowledged and recognized. And I thought, this is pretty amazing. As much as I love science, and I did since I was a kid, the feeling that I had writing something of my own thoughts, using my own imagination and making it happen, putting it out on the page, it was so much more satisfying than science ever was. I still love science, but that really led me on a path to study poetry and study writing. That's what I did for the next 20 years.
Yeah, and I know for me, it's like one of my big inspirations was the work of Gene Roddenberry with like Star Trek and all that. So it's like I relate with you with the whole love of science and engineering, but it's like obviously we took a bit of a different approach to that whole field. The next thing, which I guess kind of works into this, I know for me personally, it's like a lot of the things that he tried to say in his work was like very philosophical and like meaning of the times and like taking the problems of today and putting them under a different lens so that way people could view it differently. And I don't know, that sort of keeps me up sometimes at night. So I guess for me, it's like, I want to know like what sort of keeps you up at night, like what subjects or even just ideas like float around in your head when you're trying to fall asleep.
I think over the last couple of years, like many other people, I've been concerned about my health, the health of those around me, and as someone who either listens to or watches newscasts often, the political state of this country has me very worried. I worry about the way people interpret truth and opinion, and how often there's this blurring of the two. It just feels like it just feels dangerous. And when I can't sleep, I keep a notebook on my nightstand, and so I'll just write out my thoughts. And lately I've been thinking a lot about technology and capitalism and how they in many ways feel like a virus. We've made such great advances over the last century, but I live on the 45th floor of a high rise, and I can see the city of Chicago and how it expands from downtown, and it reminds me of the way a virus kind of takes over a body, a space. And I worry about how something infiltrates a system and turns it upon itself. And this just feels like the political state we're living in, this pandemic that we're living in, it all just feels, the relationship between the two just feels so close. And it causes anxiety, and it certainly keeps me up at night.
Staying on that sort of track, with there being like those sort of like problems that you're seeing and the ones that keep you up at night, do you sort of like reflect that sort of thing in your writing? Because I noticed that like at least with two of your pieces, like Matthew's 5:4, apologies, and Angels in the Sun, it's like you use a lot of religiously titled, and they use a lot of like religious symbols or like religious art as like their inspiration. How do you see symbols being used today to sort of like serve to show others like what you're thinking, like what you just told me, and like how have you even used symbols in your work over time to share to readers like what your thoughts are on various subjects?
I attended a reading recently, and I heard poet Patricia Smith read some new work, and she addresses acts of violence and issues related to the pandemic very explicitly, very directly, as do many other people. And for me, I have a different way of interpreting what's happening in the world around me. I've tried writing about things very directly, and it's never felt natural to me. And I think that's mostly because I want distance from what's happening around me in the moment. And I want more time to reflect. And I just need that. And so I've written a lot about my experience growing up in a Catholic family, and that experience with religion has stayed with me. It's shaped in many ways what I believe in, how I view myself, how I view others in the world. And many times I have to find a way to push away from some of these ideas that are deeply embedded in my religious upbringing, because some of the ideas are far too conservative for me. And so when I implicate some of these religious symbols in the work that I've written, they tend to be focused on larger ideas about being alive, ideas of death, and I think most importantly, I'm very interested in the idea of faith. What does it mean to believe in something, whether you know it to be true or not? What does it mean to have faith in something or someone, or even in an idea, faith in something you just simply believe in? And so one way that I interpret that is through religion. I'm working on some poems about love and faith in love. Do I believe in it? How do I see love in the world? How do I believe in love? And one of the ways that I can access those emotions within me and those ideas are often to put them through the lens of religion, because it's something that I know well. It's something that I grew up with. And so most of the time when I use any kind of symbols, they're often religious symbols, because I feel a close connection to religion, even though I don't practice now. And I don't consider myself a religious person, but there is a lot I still find within me that is informed by my religious upbringing. And so if there are any symbols that I use, it's always through that religious lens. I just think there's so much to work through when it comes to the idea of faith, and religion helps me do that.
Thank you for that. I very much appreciate the time I was able to have talking to you, because I feel like with a lot of the answers you gave me, I relate in a way that I wasn't sure I was going to, because yeah, I feel like I sort of experienced the same emotions and feelings that you are having. So it's glad to see a fellow artist who's like relatively on the same wavelength. Thank you for doing this with me, and I hope you have a good day.
Thank you so much, Matthew. It's nice to meet you.
Let's hear another poem by Ruben.
Lord, if the ancient seahorses and whales could flee, they would surge into some distant future light years ahead, like those gray shadows waiting on the bow outside my window on nights when I can't sleep. I see them. They wait to abandon this world. They must be lost apostles, not yet found by scientists, their spacecraft en route from a remote half-sleep region of space where the sun has already abandoned its orbit. It will be discovered long after I am dead, long after wind shifts have broken the body of this continent into pieces. Good Lord, take me anywhere where anything is possible. Goodbye, decaying mountain groves at the edge of the world. Lord, I am not afraid. Take me from this worthless demon of this daily life.
So let's do some post-game analysis. He was here, mid-February. As always, our visiting writers do a public reading, and then they visit classrooms and they do one-on-one tutorials. What classes did he visit, and how did those go over? How was he received by the students?
So Ruben visited Creative Writing 361, Writing for Publication, as well as Creative Writing 154, which is Intro to Creative Writing 2. They were really excellent visits. I remember in Writing for Publication, he shared with the students his own journey of getting into the publishing world, how he started serving on different mastheads. And he actually started when he was an undergraduate as working on the journal at his institution, the kind of undergraduate journal, similar to the Blue Root or Widener Ink, what we have here. And he continued doing so when he went to graduate school. And then, up until now, where he's poetry editor of Agni, which is considered one of the, considered a journal with prestige, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So that was really great to hear that. And he also shared with them advice. For example, he talked to them about how important the opening is to anything that you submit. The opening lines of your poem, the opening lines of your story, whatever you're submitting, the opening matters. He was explaining to them how it's often in the opening that the submission will either really get the editor's attention, or they might choose not to finish reading it, or they might read it, but they're not excited about it anymore. Really good practical advice. And I think the students really appreciated being able to ask someone who's in that position of actually choosing the work at that level. So that was a great visit. In 154, we focused a lot more, the questions the students asked him focused a lot more on his poetry, specifically on his own writing process and his experience writing about intimate things from his life. I know one particular student had asked him how he goes about balancing kind of a kind of confessionalism, right? A kind of being honest about his life and his work and his identity, right? And I think this is coming very much from an LGBTQ perspective of, how do you share these things and talk about these things in your work, knowing that everyone can possibly read it. And Ruben, shared with them considerations of audience, considerations of, where your work appears changes who reads it and how they understand it. And also the idea that you have to be vulnerable. You have to be vulnerable on the page, and you can decide after you've written the poem who you want to publish it, where you want it to appear, and who you want to read it. But in the moment that you're writing it, you have to be willing to be vulnerable. That was one of the big things he emphasized during his visit. And I think the students really appreciated hearing about his process in that way.
It's it takes a lot of courage to be vulnerable, doesn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's one of the things I both love the most about writing and reading, right? Because to me, I love reading other people's vulnerabilities because it reminds me of my own and it makes me reflect on my own.
Yes. So thanks again for doing this. This is awesome.
No problem. Thank you for having me.
The English Suite podcast is produced by yours truly, Jim Ish, with assistance from Chloe D. Flumeri, Sienna Bowers, Gabby Norris, Sbressa Yimarai, Matt Lomas, and Christina Giska. The music for today's podcast was contributed by our very own Dr. Mark Grable, Professor of American Literature and Master Guitarist. Thanks, Mark.
Thanks for listening to the English Suite. If you'd like to give feedback, email us at widenerenglishsuite@gmail.com. You can subscribe to our podcast at anchor.fm, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and many other podcasting applications.